Yeah, so Filament is a company that's been in this space for a while, in a sense that it's like we've seen a lot of the evolution happen between great ideas and great future kind of focused, oriented ideals, all the way up to the trough of despair when it's like this is really hard and these big companies don't want to work really fast, into now kind of this possible future. Today I kind of want to just touch a little bit about being a startup who's trying to help enable most of you, OEM automakers, tier one auto suppliers, partners, and conglomerates to work within the auto industry. And kind of give you a lay of the land of what we see, what categories are starting to emerge from a product and usability standpoint, what things aren't working, how do we make you all faster? That might be the biggest question. Startups, of course, are timed and aligned with venture capital timing, which is usually in 18-month segments. Automotive companies work in years and decades. And so to try to get the impedance mismatch to work correctly is sometimes a challenge. But I do want to share with you all today a little bit about some of the perspective we see. It's interesting, too, because most of what I realized this morning as I was listening to the other presenters and the panels is that my pitch deck looks very much like everyone else's, which is, I think, a good sign. I think, from a meta standpoint, we are aligning as a group. And again, thank you, the MOBI consortium, to really drive that point home and to really solidify the commonalities that I think are emerging within this space. Information asymmetry is this interesting concept where you see this used politically or commercially or even socially and civically around if knowledge isn't equally distributed, it's hard to actually figure out how to ideally move forward with the maximum amount of value for everybody. So that was yesterday is we have this problem within mobility is how do we equally share information? Information being perhaps, is a car available to purchase? These sorts of things you've heard all day. We see that it's moving that way, and I think that everyone here probably agrees that this concept of case, connectivity, autonomy, sharing our services, and electrification is changing how that works in the mobility industry. It's always fun to put a big number up on a slide. Who knows if this number is correct? McKinsey thinks it's this number. I don't think anyone doubts that this will fundamentally change this industry. There's a company we've spoken to in the last year who sat down with us and said, we are a very old company in the automotive world. We've been around for very, very many decades. And we don't know how we'll sell vehicles in the next 10 years. Kind of alluding to the fact that they helped invent the vehicle. Many different companies did, but they were one of the early pioneers. And it's telling when a company is that old and they're starting to think about how their world is going to change. And it's our job, we think, as Filament and other startups and other partners in this ecosystem to help enable and to encourage them to start thinking less about their vehicles as a product and thinking more about their vehicles as a platform on which you build services and new products. That's a different fundamental change. And if you start thinking about a vehicle as a platform, you need to imbue it with technologies that platforms have. Identity, as you've heard from Robin earlier, APIs, connectivity, the ability to actually transact is the grand vision here. We have heard this across the board at a couple of different partners and discussions we've had with potential customers around really getting tied in with this tokenization idea. And tokens are great. Tokenization, I think, is a very important mechanic, but it is just one mechanic of many that are needed. As you've heard before, and I'll repeat it again, tokenization is simply, in our perspective, this representation and record of rights and obligations, or you could consider ownership, tied to underlying assets. And I think, a presenter, Alex, earlier this morning described very clearly why you want non-copying, the inability to copy a piece of data in the situation. He made a very clear case for why that's important. And we totally agree. Another way to think about tokens that we like to actually use with some of the people who are a little bit newer to this is that when perhaps you may remember this based on your generation, when you were a kid, you would go to arcades and they would you have tokens, and the tokens can only be used at the arcade. And sometimes you won tokens when you'd play the games at the arcade, and you could trade them in for toys and food and things like that. That's a type of currency, right? A very localized currency, a community currency within that place. And that was really a type of token. Literally, we called them tokens. You move into rewards points, also a type of token, locked to a particular customer or location or brand. And I'm sure we all have different airline points and things like that. Venmo and PayPal started to break that apart and said, well, we can start to actually pay people with this, right? People can be the vendor of the tokens. And of course, now we're moving into the version 3, which really is what I think we're all here about. So I won't belabor that point. This is another thing we hear a lot from our customers, and we thought we'd throw this meme up to give a little chuckle, is that automakers, every large company in every industry, it's not fair to pick on auto, has a digital strategy and a digitization strategy, whether that's becoming paperless, which was the hotness from the integrators 10 years ago. More recently, we've heard a lot of, we want to token the things, we want to token everything. And it's kind of, it's good, but in the right time, we think. And we tend at Filament to be pragmatists. We tend to really want to focus on solving real problems that can demonstrate real value to your stakeholders, fundamentally your executive committee, as soon as possible. Because anything after that is just science experiment. And we don't want to be too harsh on this point, but it really is critical to, for other startups, I implore you to help show value now. Make it so that you're always waiting on them. As a vendor, as a supporter, because that is how these big companies run. And I'm talking to the few startups in the room here, as if the rest of you were not in the room. But it's really important, I think, to help enable these companies to be heroes within their own corporations, because these are hundreds of thousands of people at these companies, and it's critical to show that value as soon as possible. And so we kind of joke within our company around, this seems to be the sentiment a lot of times, and we sometimes have to pull some of our early contacts at these companies back to saying, well, how do we show you the value now? Because I guarantee you when you pitch a cryptocurrency to your CFO, you're going to have a problem, because they're not going to know how to categorize that, and they're going to have to tax that. And if the wallet is actually held in the vehicle, and the vehicle crashes, or the vehicle crosses jurisdictional lines, how are you going to tax that? It gets very, very interesting very fast. And while we see that future as a very real possibility, we have a few steps to get there. So, pragmatism. When machines can trust their data, they do so much more. So a little background about Filament quickly. I don't want this to become any sort of anything other than a description of our company. We make hardware wallets that actually go into the vehicle. We also make firmware that acts as a hardware wallet that can go into vehicles' head units and electronic control units, ECUs, that act as the identifier. Like many of you have a wallet that you carry in your purse or in your pocket. It has identification and the ability to pay. That is what the wallet does for the vehicle. We manufacture and create that. We've been doing this for several years. We also make the APIs and pieces that go along with that. So as Robin mentioned earlier, there's a wallet that is required to make this work. We believe that it is essential to have some sort of wallet within every vehicle to realize all of these opportunities. What does the wallet do? Quickly, trust, proof of origin, proof of integrity. Are you who you say you are is a very, very important thing if you're going to pay a machine as a counterparty. In the world of contract law, not even necessarily smart contracts, you've got this concept of rights and obligations. You owe me, I owe you. Who is the you in the counterparty of the contract? You can prove that with a hardware wallet in the vehicle. So if a vehicle wishes to be a counterparty, or if the owner of that vehicle wishes for it to be a counterparty to a transaction, that vehicle must have an identification mechanism through this hardware wallet. The access also, having a hardware wallet now allows the machine to be in a blockchain platform of choice, whether it's the Daimler efforts that they're doing or alternatives. There is an important piece that this allows now for the vehicle to, what's a good word? Put out, hang its shingle, for lack of a better term, or to say it's ready for business. It's open for business on a platform. And so now it starts to make the information asymmetry a little more resolved. Lastly, we're obviously very strong believers in standards ourselves. We, I think, are among the first companies that actually have implemented the Mobi VID Spec 1.0. We have it upstairs on our demo table, actually with the VBC signed, running. We do have to, unfortunately, mock the signature of the OEM because we are not an OEM. But other than that piece, it is actually working. It's actually generation of that, and we're attesting data of geolocation using the VBC standard, the VID standard, the VBC part in it. And we believe these standards are important. We have a lot of opinions about what's missing out of it. As you implement standards, you realize quickly this part's a little weak, or we could actually do a little bit better on this part, and that's perfect. Like, that's what growth looks like. So we're actually very happy that Mobi's done the hard work. The entire crew, but especially the VID working group, on all the late nights and all the, what I've heard are lively conversations about roles and how that should work out. We thank you, seriously, because this is what allows implementers like us to actually get this going and provide it back to you all and say, look, here's your brainchild, and we're a part of this too, but here's fundamentally this group's brainchild that you can actually start using today, and moving from POC concept like science experiments to actually piloting and starting to see real revenue. So to shift gears a little bit, Filament, it's fascinating. This morning and this afternoon, even hearing all the different examples, like the panel earlier who talked about what is the most killer app you can think of, right? The one that Chris was managing and or was moderating, excuse me. Every single example I've heard this morning and this afternoon all fall within the 3 categories or buckets that we've also identified. So that's a really great confirmation that we all seem to be seeing the same things. In the world of these blockchain or mobility platforms, we almost always, from the people we've spoken to, have use cases that fall in one of these 3 categories of products. The first one being this wallet and ID applications. This is everything from just a simple vehicle identity to the user identity, which is delegated to the vehicle. That's some nuances about what Robin was mentioning earlier about how you actually glue a vehicle to a user for a time, perhaps a rider in a rideshare. Versus the owner, et cetera. Vehicle to merchant payments, fuel payments, tolls, electrification, charging, parking payments. The world of in-vehicle payment falls in this bucket. Some of the work that Filament has done is focused explicitly on this from the start. It's a tall effort because it's a heavy lift because there's a lot that needs to happen there. You need the counterparty like the charge station to also be involved in the transaction at the blockchain level or the DLT level. And we're not quite there yet, but I think everyone is working diligently to get there. So that's the first bucket, payments, in-vehicle payments. The second one is just the usage-based applications. And so whenever anyone talks about, is it like Zipcar, is it like Car2Go, is it like Uber, is it like Lyft, is it dynamic leasing, it all falls under usage-based applications. Vehicle share, trusted lock, unlock, this gets into the active CAN world, CAN bus world, where you want to lock or unlock a vehicle remotely. Sometimes even start it if you have the immobilizer integrated. Usage-based insurance as well. This, to me, is probably one of the shortest term and closest to real revenue categories of the 3. In fact, I would argue it's probably the earliest, the best short-term one. I don't have, many people disagree with me on that, and they often have more data than I do, so I trust their opinion very highly. But from our perspective, we can show ROI, and we'll get into a slide in a moment of what that looks like pretty quickly with this one, because vehicles exist today, and they're underutilized today. And I don't think anyone disagrees with that. And so to be able to remove the additional friction that Uber and Lyft have started to do is a big opportunity for those who manufacture vehicles. The last one being trusted history or trusted vehicle history applications. So this gets into we call it trusted vehicle history, at least I do inside the company. This gets into everything from fraud, counterfeit components like airbags, which is a big problem, residual value preservation. How do you preserve or increase the used car value market? Usage history, service history, parts provenance. This whole bucket, this whole world is to try to preserve and increase the value. And the presentation this morning, fantastic presentation about how to reduce the cost or increase the value on that economic price cost curve slide sets the point home really nice. If you can prove that the performance and service history of a vehicle has been maintained over the course of its history, by almost definition, you can prove that, or you can attest that you are better than the car that does not have that, and thus demand a higher price on the used car market. One particular automaker has described to us some research they did that shows that the used car market in North America is highly undervalued because Americans, at least, seem to think that 100,000 miles is still it for a vehicle. It's a psychological problem. Why, we probably wouldn't be in this situation right now if we had adopted the metric system a while ago, but here we are today. So obviously that's not true. We can get up to 200, 250,000 miles on most vehicles today as long as they're serviced regularly. Well, how do we know they're serviced regularly? I don't know about you. I recently bought a used car for one of my children, and it was literally boiled down to, I guess I believe what you're telling me, and these stack of Jiffy Lube papers to determine whether or not this has actually been serviced correctly. And it was a 2009 Honda Civic, pretty simple, basic, straight-ahead car. I have no idea what its history is, and we continue to find out what its history is as we continue to own it and see what it's fine. And it's fascinating that that is literally how these transactions happen in the used car market today. And we probably shouldn't accept that as the future. So there's a whole realm of applications on this side to really try to change the way that happens. The premise of this particular automaker was that if you can increase the used car price value, it helps your used car, certified, service or dealerships rather, but it also would let you eventually raise the new car price, assuming we still buy cars in the next 20 years. So a pragmatic guide to automation disruption. This is really one of the last points I want us to home, again, from Filament's perspective, is that when we think about this grand vision, this brave future, brave new world, really, of vehicles as platforms with products and services built on it, we see it, without simplifying it too much, it really is just a way to re-implement a less frictioned business automation platform. At the end of the day, I think, again, Robin, I think, mentioned this too. It's very interesting how similar our slides are because we didn't compare them at all before this. It's the first time I met Robin today, actually. But it's interesting because we do see this as an automation exercise at the end of the day. Those of you who are software architects or systems architects would probably identify with this well, is that if you can boil it down to some of these core design patterns, you can start to use the best practices from prior efforts to make it happen in this world. And for us, it seems to be business automation with a trust component, a provability component starts to change a lot of these things. So we think of that through these lenses as we dig into these pieces. This has to be simply integrated. There's got to be simple integrations. When you start working with, I'm talking to the startups in the room again, when you start working with big, large OEMs and partners and tier ones, they do have very significant, very talented people within their teams, but they're also very limited in their resource availability. So it's got to be simple. Like, it's got to be almost, I could try this on my own, right? I could hack on this on the side on my lunch break and see if I can get something running, level of easy, at least to start exploring. So we offer, the platforms and the work we've done has tried to really make that simple. Another piece is how do you automate the revenue? Do the work to integrate with Stripe if you're going to build, tools or components to help OEMs and help partners to actually integrate this. Do the extra work. Build the reports that show the audits. Let them dig down into actually seeing the signature verification. Let them check hash blocks if you wish, or if they wish, rather. Let them easily drill down. That's a lot of busy work that oftentimes a lot of very smart, visionary technologists don't necessarily like to do. It feels like it's boring work, but it's absolutely the piece that makes this easy for someone else. We often joke inside of Filament, it's hard to make something easy because you have to do a lot of the extra work. The third one that is often not talked about as much, it's starting to increase, which is great, is that any platform today that does not talk about the privacy compliance requirements in the world today, specifically GDPR, and then, of course, California Consumer Privacy Act, which is enacting, I think, in 2020, with being retroactive to 2019, which is its own special, terrifying concept, has to be addressed at the core. I would argue we need to go so far as to consider privacy, regulatory compliance as critical to any platform as security is to any platform. You cannot tack this on later. You cannot unring a bell. So if there's privacy, if by nature of the architecture of the platform you're using, data must be viewed to be validated, you are in deep trouble. You cannot go to production with something like that, even if it shows pure revenue. You can't convince the regulatory compliance folks within that OEM to actually say yes to this if it is absolutely dead in the water because you have no ability to guarantee GDPR compliance. And that's a whole different technical discussion and a difficult challenge, but it must be addressed at the start. Lastly, standardized data security. So, leverage as much of the existing, crypto, not cryptocurrency, but the cryptography ecosystem as possible, right? There are really good mechanics, cryptographic primitives that most of us use, Diffie-Hellman key exchange and AES encryption, and these are systems that have been formally verified and proven to work. Use them as much as possible so that you're minimizing the variables that can go wrong when you build this new platform. So, we see this expanding outside of mobility, energy infrastructure, et cetera, financial markets. I won't touch too much on this, but really we see these as sister industries to mobility, obviously energy with EVs, and then infrastructure, even supply chain to some degree, because things need to move, and mobility often deals with moving things. So we appreciate the fact that this tokenization of things will absolutely bleed over into these others. I personally appreciate that it's starting with mobility. Lastly, I'll touch a little bit about actual projects we worked on, and then we'll maybe get a couple questions. We obviously can't talk about who we work with. There are a couple public PR pieces that have been released by some of our customers. You can Google that if you want, but that's not really interesting to today. What's interesting today is that we often start our discussions early on with how do you see more revenue? Like pick a use case and then let's actually work on the business projections. Technology will come. So we've showed a 200% ROI on just process automation for some remanufacturing of parts. Increased residual value, that was that kind of trusted vehicle history increase for used car market per vehicle, which gets pretty big if you get into the millions of vehicles in the used car market, as well as a tier one auto supplier for giving them new revenue markets for state of health of EV battery components. So it's asset utilization kind of in that space. So want to open up for a couple of questions. I talked a lot. I always like to get a couple of perspectives from the audience. So with that, any questions on what we talked about? Some there.
How about community as a fourth component around both usage as well as on your and then also as a fifth component that you would
like community as its own pillar.
As its own pillar, yes.
Absolutely, I completely agree. It's absolutely an essential component, perhaps one I should have explicitly listed, but by nature of the people in this room today, I hope that community as an important pillar is a given, but perhaps it's not for many who are outside this room. So absolutely, the community is what builds this, and I'm a firm believer that technology serves people, never the other way around. And so in that sense, it's us that decide what kind of future we want to live in. And obviously we have, based on your position, you have shareholders to keep happy, you have quarterly earnings reports to deal with, but fundamentally, you are people, and we are people. And so I certainly want to always keep that in mind, and I think that having the community almost as an umbrella over all of this is absolutely the correct way to think about it. So thank you for making that explicit. Other questions?
How much fun was it to implement the Mobi VID?
Oh, you should ask my engineers back there. They're here today. They had, I don't know. I shouldn't speak for them. I will say that they had some very good example or good suggestions for an individual we spoke with earlier about, hey, I'll give you a good example. If you take an entire hash of the VVC and you say this is the signature for the OEM, but then you present roles that only allow a subset of those, literally those terms, those properties within the JSON chunk, you cannot validate a subset of that with the entire hash because it's going to be a different hash. So if you have a subset privacy exposure to a VBC, yet you still need to validate the signature, you now cannot, unless you sign each property and check them individually. So these are the sorts of little things that were just like, it was so close, right? But it's okay because it's a good start. And then we can start to move into doing it better and fixing it. And no Just like no product survives first exposure to a customer, like no spec survives first exposure to like a product, right? It's like it just never does, because the real world and the conference room world collide, and out comes some atoms and some electrons and ions or whatever, and hopefully you have a new mass here you can work with and you can build new things with it. Yep.
Yeah, you talked about Filament providing the identity to the vehicle and having a wallet, right, at the vehicle level. And you talked about use cases such as, making payments for insurance and things of that nature. What about we have a product which is focused on loyalty points, which we believe is very applicable to incent user behavior, but it can also be part of a machine's behavior. If it fills gas at some point, maybe it earns points. How easy is it? Have you thought about use cases where people like us could use Filament's hardware wallet, essentially, in order to create our own wallet to store, say, loyalty points?
Absolutely, yeah. So it's important to note, without getting too much in the details of our technology, but yes, quickly, the hardware wallet that we've developed is, it's blockchain agnostic, for lack of a better term. You can store multiple wallets, just like your wallet can hold multiple credit cards and debit cards. This one's for that. I've got a loyalty card, Starbucks card, maybe you have a AAA card, usage-based insurance, right? Like you can put them all in the same wallet, same exact thing technically with ours. And so we would encourage and hope that others are building those sorts of things with the wallet. We just insist, the reason we built the wallet in the first place is because we've been at this for like 7 years now, right? So for better or worse, we chose to get into the hardware space. A lot of people are like, you're crazy, and they're probably not wrong. But we did get into this because you cannot do anything without a wallet, a hardware wallet. You cannot do anything of verifiable proof without a hardware secure enclave that has the cryptographic key. The private ones has to stay private, period, end of story. Any other model I know of always falls apart. And then you can't build the cool stuff on top if the foundation fails. So we wanted to be as useful and as generic as possible, but it had to exist. Now, we already are not the only one that makes wallets. Other ones do now, and we won't be the last one. Maybe there will be 1,000 of them, and then every car has it. That's a perfect world, because now we can build those products and services on top. So we would encourage people to consider new loyalty program wallets or even cryptocurrency wallets of their choice based on what they're building. Yeah.